it's great to be here talking about this stuff in such an interesting part of the world. There's such an opportunity to go and do something really exciting locally here, and the whole world has got the Lake District on its radar, and there's a chance to kind of show what can be done and have some real leadership that can be influential. So, okay, I'm going to talk sort of about some of the stuff in There's No Planet B, put a slightly more foodie flavour on it than I normally, only slightly more than I normally put on a talk about this book. The first 60 pages are all about kind of where food fits into the whole thing. But this book is about, I've been working on climate change in the climate change area for coming on for 15 years now, and the more you think about the climate change problem, the more inescapably clear it becomes that if you really want to deal with it, you have to see climate change as part of something, as a symptom of something bigger that's going on. It's just one symptom. And actually, we need to deal with it and look at it in that way if we're ever going to get on top of it. And so what is that bigger thing that's going on? Let's see if, that's backwards. That's going on. And a way to get into it is to look at this curve of global energy use. Sorry, that last bit of it should be dotted for the future. But we've been growing our energy supply as a species for millennia. And that growth rate always used to be very small, but it's got bigger and bigger. And from about 1850 to about 1970, it averaged about 1% growth rate per year. But since then, over the last 50 years, it's averaged about 2.4% per year. So that's a factor of 10 every century. And all that energy supply has enabled us to do loads of great things, and it's enabled us to develop a whole lot of fantastic technology that's made our lives better, arguably in lots of ways. And I'd be dead without some of it. But our use of that energy supply has enabled us to, through our use of that energy supply, we've influenced the planet increasingly through a mixture of accident and design. And as our energy supply has gone up, so our influence over the planet has gone up. And meanwhile, the planet hasn't become any more resilient to the sorts of things that we can do to it. And that didn't matter for ages that we were getting more powerful, because the planet was still a big, robust playground compared to anything that our small species could throw at it. But gradually, over the centuries, that balance has changed, and very suddenly, now, it's taken us into an incredibly interesting, important, and critical moment. And, oops, that's backwards again. So some people use this big word for it, the Anthropocene, and all we mean by that is, it's the time in which suddenly it's humans that are the biggest thing affecting the ecosystem. So we used to be like that little species, little people running around on a big world. Now it's the other way around, and we're in it like it or not. And we can argue about exactly when we entered this Anthropocene. But what's right now about it is that right now is the moment in which, if we don't change the way that we operate, in response to the fact that we're in the Anthropocene, we're going to hit the consequences. The consequences are going to come and bite us very, very hard. And this is a totally new context for humanity to be operating in. And all the ways in which we used to do life in the old days, when the planet was big and robust, it's very unclear how much of that is still fit for purpose here in the Anthropocene. But what is clear is that we need to radically improve the quality of our stewardship in a way we've never had to before. And also, we're faced with a whole load of challenges now which are inescapably global and connected and systemic. And that's why we need to look at everything at once. It's no good looking at climate change over here and food over here and population over here and biodiversity over here. Actually, we need to join all those things up together, and many more things as well. So that's what the book's about. There it is. And the idea is it's an attempt to put absolutely everything in one place, all the environmental things, but also behind the environmental things, because it turns out, the one-liner is, it turns out that from a technical and scientific point of view, there's no reason why we can't get on top of all the challenges that we face. So that takes us into a whole lot of even more interesting terrain about what would it take for us to be solving those technically solvable challenges. Anyway, so it's all there in the book, and it's packed full of maths and stats and so on. And the reason for that, it's not only about that, but the reason why it's got so much of that in it is when I've put in what I think are perspective-forcing statistics that just force you to think, suddenly make you think, well, why are we living like this when we could be living like this? And how much more trouble are we going to get into if we keep going like this? But on the other hand, how much opportunity is there to do it totally differently and just make our lives better while we're at it? So that's the book, and it's not really about understanding it one bit at a time. That's why I've put it all up in one slide. Really, I should just stop talking and you just stare at that slide and just absorb the whole lot simultaneously, because we need to hold it all in our heads in one go. Just before I go any further, I'll just quickly cover this off because Elon Musk and others have been talking as if this one planet living thing might be temporary, and it's getting serious traction in some quarters. So I just did some basic GCSE level, or if you're my age, O-level physics, just to see if we can nail this question: is there really no planet B? So the nearest planet that could be any good for us to live on turns out to be pretty local. It's only 4 light years away. And if you're prepared to put up with a long journey, a 40-year journey, you only need to travel at 1/10 of the speed of light. So let's just have a look at the kinetic energy of a person traveling through space at 1/10 of the speed of light. Just the person, just the energy that's in that person just through the fact that they're traveling at that speed. And it turns out to be as much energy as 500,000 people get through in a year. And that's just a person flying through space in their underwear, which of course is instant death. So if you start factoring in things like giving them a spaceship and giving them some kit, and I did some sums, so I just gave them the spaceship the size of my little Peugeot 107 car, which I wouldn't want to be in for 40 years. And a few other bits and pieces, some kit to stop them, to help them, so you can slow down at the other end so you don't crash into your new home at 30,000 kilometers a second. If you do all those things, then what you find is that actually a handful of people, like about the numbers of people, how many of us there are in this room, if we were to set off on a journey like that, it would take about the whole of humanity's annual energy supply. Just to do that, leaving nothing at all left for the 7.7 billion back on Earth. No energy supply to eat, stay warm, move anywhere, wear clothes, nothing whatsoever. So we're stuck on this beautiful planet A for generation after generation from now, like it or not. So suddenly we need to learn to live in a way that doesn't keep increasing our impacts. So Star Trek is fiction. Okay, and just to give a flavour of some of that joined up, those joined up challenges that we need to deal with. So, there's a huge biodiversity challenge. There are some bees and there are some plants, just to illustrate, and biodiversity doesn't get as much airtime as climate change, but it's actually just as big a challenge and just as critical. And one of the species that's going on in the world, of course, is us, and there's more and more of us every year. And we've got this beautiful world, but we're filling it up with plastic. That's another thing going on. And somehow this growing population has to eat, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. And that food all comes from somewhere. Look, there's even some sheep from nearby. And there's another thing going on, is an impending antibiotics crisis that doesn't bear thinking about, and 2/3 of the world's antibiotics are being fed to farm animals. And then finally onto our energy supply, and we get our energy from all these different sources, mainly from sources like that chimney there, but a little bit from solar panels and a tiny bit from wind turbines. And there's one symptom of climate change. And then finally, we've all got to live somewhere, and we all live in different environments, and some people live in places like that, there's London, and some people live in places like that, which could be any one of 100,000 places in the world. But one question to ask is, well, is it possible to deal with all these global systemic challenges without having a world in which there's a kind of a sense of us treating each other with the respect and equality that might be required to broker these global arrangements to look after the whole planet? So that's just to give a flavour of some of the stuff that's all going on in one go. And here's the challenge again then. So arguably we have a chance to live better than ever, but if we carry on the trajectory we're on at the moment, we will definitely live worse than ever, or not living at all, many of us not living at all. And it is that serious, and it is that immediate. And if we're not getting a flutter of adrenaline at some of the stuff that we're hearing from the science now, then something's not working properly. David King, the former chief scientist, was criticised recently for coming out and saying that he was scared by climate change. And the criticism that was made from some scientists was to say, well, you shouldn't that won't play out well with the public. The public doesn't like to hear that things are scary. But he's just presenting evidence. He's just presenting evidence about the reaction that he has to the science that he knows a lot about. And I've been in a room with him hearing about him justifying the Climate Repair Centre. It's all about geoengineering. And he was saying, well, why we're doing this? It's because, if you look at the probability, the risk that we're exposed to every year now, for example, of a major failure of the rice crop, that's why. And if you think about what a major failure of the rice crop would do to the whole kind of stability of global society. And he also talked about methane exploding out of the permafrost in Russia with explosions that can be heard 300 kilometers away and so on. It creates a sense of really a world that we this is an optimistic talk, don't worry. But we need to stare it in the face. We absolutely have to see change now, big change now, or it's trouble. So missed the slide somehow. But anyway, so in the green stuff around the edge is all is just some of the physical challenges: energy, climate emergency, food, ocean acidification, antibiotics, population, biodiversity, plastics, other pollutants, and transport. And then within that, in blue, so some of the things that we might need to do. Technology. What is the role of technology going forwards? What about business? Do we need to frame up the whole way we think about the role of business in the world? Investment. I spent half of last week talking to investment bankers and asset managers about what they can do, which is plenty. Economics, which has been honed over millennia in a different context where we could just grow and expand, and now it's unsurprising that it needs reworking. The whole way we think about money, metrics, inequality, politics, completely. I'll just touch on that slightly. And then right at the centre, I'll talk about values and thinking skills that we might need for the 21st century. And lots of people I've talked to have said, maybe that's the crunch point of it all. And I'll get on to within this, I'll talk quite a bit about the food stuff as we go. So just very quickly on climate change, and we've heard a lot about it, and including some tonight, but I want to emphasize this. This is the globe of carbon emissions that we've heard is 37 billion tons. And if you look at that curve, there is not any trace at all of evidence that curve has noticed that humans have noticed climate change. And I'm not saying this to be depressing, but it does tell us that we need to interrupt the global dynamics of growth are working in such a way that small-scale actions on their own don't actually create the system change that we need, and we need to, at the end of the day, interrupt this whole thing at the global system level. And I'll talk about the role of individuals in creating that. We need that just illustrates how much we need to raise our game right now, because we have to have that change. And it's not about just doing more of what we've already done. It's about creating a big system change. And the reason for that is it's a bit like squeezing a balloon. If one part of the world or one person makes a small change, the trouble is that the rest of the global system at the moment is just kind of adopting and taking up the slack. And that's why we're not seeing any benefits coming through. This is actually an old slide from a previous book, but that's how much fossil fuel there is in the world, and that's how much we can burn for a 75% chance of staying within 2 degrees, which we're now clear would be really, really dangerous. In fact, if you listen to David King, he says 1.1 degrees where we're at now is dangerous, 1.5 is pretty dangerous, and 2 degrees is unthinkable. And that's because of some of the feedback things we might trigger and the big disruptions that we might trigger at those sorts of temperatures. And here's the amazing thing, the amazing part, the most fascinating part of the whole climate change challenge is the human response to it. But I would just say, see that head in the sand there, I would say the last few months, right, within the last year, it's been such an interesting moment, and we have seen, I find myself, on the one hand, in the last year, the science has quite seriously got more scary. But on the other hand, there is, over the last year, I'd say the beginnings of evidence that that head is just starting to wriggle its way out of the sand. And if it could just come all the way up, if we all pull hard, it's one of those things, you pull and pull and pull at a problem, you get nowhere, and then suddenly you start to get some movement, and it might be that if we all push hard now, it might be a very short space of time before we all properly wake up and properly get on top of the challenge. There's certainly a lot more evidence of that now than there was a year ago. Just some time for some good news. I said that we've got this crisis over our climate change, so here's that dot there is the scale. And that is the size of solar panels that we would require to replace the whole of humanity's energy supply. Right? That's all it is, 228 miles by 228 miles. And of course there's a lot more technical detail in that. You've got to transmit it to everywhere, you've got to store it, you've got to deal with the fact that some countries have a lot of sun and we don't have much of it, and all kinds of things like that. But this is the point I'm making is this is a really inherently solvable challenge. And all the technologies for it are there or thereabouts. But I also said that we're growing our energy supply at the moment. And if we keep growing our energy supply, we'll just have those renewables as well as the fossil fuel. And not only that, but if it's one dot now, I said we're growing energy at a factor of 10 every century. So if that's what it looks like now, in 100 years it would look like that, in 200 years it would look like that, and in 300 years it would look like that, with the entire Earth's surface plus a bit more, or Earth's land area plus more, totally covered in solar panels right over the fells with no spaces whatsoever in between them, all over the world. So the point I'm making is, now is the moment we actually need to stop growing our energy supply, get more efficient with it, and bag the savings so that the world's fossil fuel needs stays in the ground. Just a graph of who gets the sunlight. I'm afraid you'll see that this is the scale, and the colour scheme is the sunlight per person. The darker the more per person. We've got the 5th worst sunlight per person statistics of any major country in the world. Australia gets 200 times more than us, so there we are looking sort of all skinny and pale up there. I'll just skip over this one for speed. But we've got a little bit more wind. This is an analysis of the wind energy. You can see us looking slightly bigger and slightly more coloured. So we can make our renewable energy supply work, but it's a bit of an interesting higgledy-piggledy mix in this country compared to some other countries. And I put this slide in especially because here we are in Cumbria, and Cumbria County Council approved planning permission to open up a new coal mine off the west coast. And one of the arguments, because of a completely bogus load of arguments that look lovely if you just glance at them, but actually when you unpick them they were completely bogus. And one of the arguments was that actually most of the coal will be burned overseas, so it's okay, it won't be on the UK's books. Right? Seriously. And so a few of us have spent and two people in particular, Maggie Mason and Henry Adams, have worked really hard on articulating the case against this to the Secretary of State. But one of the things I just want to make clear, everything that gets extracted gets burned to meet a human consumption need. So those 3 carriages always travel at the same speed. You need to slow them all down, cut our carbon footprints, stop burning the fuel, and stop taking it out of the ground. I think I'm a bit conscious of time, but just quickly, I'm just doing smatterings of things from the book. There's a graph of human transport and how it's been growing over time. This is including everything. The green is walking, and including, walking around between here and the kettle or whatever, or here and the food. Every step you take is not exactly, but it's estimated in the green bit. So that's going up a little bit. the driving's in grey, the train travels in orange, and the white is the flying. So the two we really need to watch there is the flying and the driving. Just very quickly, come the low carbon world, almost all transport is going to require land one way or another. And so if you can do different things with a square metre of land. So this is just a quick analysis of how many miles could you get from a square metre of land if you did different things with it. So this is, you grow a grass crop and you use it for biofuel and you power a car. How many miles could you go? You could, for a square metre of land, you could go about 5 miles per year. What if you grew wheat and turned it into bread and fed a cyclist? Well, that would get you about 25 miles a year, so it's much better. What if you put a solar panel on it and powered an electric car, suddenly 1,000 miles a year? And what if you powered an electric bike instead? Well, there you go, 21,000 miles a year. So electric bikes for the Lake District, although I'm going to stick to my old traditional one. I'm going to sort of go finally onto food, land and sea, which is actually how I start the book off with the first 60 pages or so. And this is based on some research at Lancaster University, these first slides. So this is just tracking how much food there is in edible crops that are grown by region. And the dotted line there shows 2,350 calories per person per day, which is about the average global requirement. And you can see that, and that the one on the end here is the world. But you can see every region of the world's got a surplus. North America's got a massive surplus. They're growing nearly 20,000 human edible calories per person per day. So we looked at the journey between the field and the fork and other endpoints just to see what happens to those calories, because there's a huge surplus going on there. So there it is. The green chunk there is the 6,000 calories per person per day at the global level that we grow, human edible crops. And the brown bit underneath it is the grass pasture and the calories in grass pasture and stover that we can't digest, but farm animals can. And that's nearly 4,000 calories. So we grow it, and a bit, just following the green bit, a bit gets lost in harvest losses, and we should try and reduce those. A bit gets lost in storage, and we should try and reduce that. And there's quite a bit we can do to reduce that, but there's still plenty. Then what happens? This is where we work out what to do with all that food. The yellow slither is the bit we save as seed for next year. That's a really good idea, so we can eat next year as well. The green bit stays in the food system. The blue bit, 800 calories per person per day or so. That's non-food uses, mainly biofuel. And if you get that human edible food and enough to give me the calories I need for a day, but instead turn it into biofuel to power my little Peugeot 107 car, you could power that car for 1 mile. Right? 1 mile against a day's worth of calories for me. That's how steep the trade-off is between feeding people and biofuel. And then the brown chunk, the huge brown chunk down there, is the human edible crop that we feed to farm animals, inherently human edible. So farm animals are eating nearly 3/4 of the whole calorific requirement for humanity. So they eat both those two chunks in brown. Oops. And they give us back that red slither, nearly 600 calories per person per day. And the big grey chunk there is the animal losses. That's the stuff that they lose just by walking around, wasting energy, walking around, keeping warm, some of them burping up methane. This is just to highlight the huge inherent inefficiency in having a lot of meat and dairy in the human edible foods, in the human food supply. And I say this quickly, I'm not a vegetarian or a vegan, but it is all about the proportions. It's clear cut. We need to reduce the proportion of meat and dairy a lot in the global diet, but especially in the UK diet. So just carrying on through the journey, we lose a bit more in distribution and processing, but that's not actually very much. And consumers waste a bit. That's at the global level. At the UK level, it will be higher than that. And there's a net excess consumption. We eat a little bit more than is required on average, even though some people don't get enough. So this tells us, one, there is enough food if we could just share it around the world and get the supply chains going to all the right places. Two, we've got to watch biofuels like crazy. because of the steepness of that trade-off between food and so on. But the most important message in this whole thing is the inefficiency of feeding human edible crop to farm animals. And all that grass, pasture and stover, by the way, because when we look at our food system, we need to look after our biodiversity that is currently hemorrhaging, and we need to feed a growing global population, and we need to deal with climate change. So it's and for all those reasons, the reduction of the change in diet and the reduction of human edible crops to farm animals is massively important. I've just looked at calories, but this is exactly the same chart for protein, and it shows exactly the same story. So animals just as inefficient with the protein supply. Just to labour the point even further, this is comparing 100 grams of soybeans to 100 grams of beef. And you see that the soybeans have got more calories, more protein, more iron and more zinc in them. And yet if you feed 100 grams of soybeans to a cow, you probably only get 10 grams of beef back or something like that. So there's just a huge loss in the system. And I've mentioned the antibiotics as well. And then this is just the greenhouse gases per 50 grams of protein. So a quarter of the average UK person's carbon footprint comes from their food, and the biggest deal within that is about the meat and dairy. And there's kind of a hierarchy. At the very top we've got beef, probably in Brazil, just a beef for a beef herd where they're not even getting any milk from the herd. That's the highest, most carbon intensive. But right down at the bottom, far less carbon intensive are all the plant-based sources. This is a tiny bit of work we did, this isn't in the book, for the Nadler and Swindle farms at Haweswater, the RSPB farm. And we just looked at the money going, we looked at the inputs and outputs to their sheep for them. So this is the money, the financial bit there is the money being spent on sheep feed plus medicines, which was mainly antibiotics I think. Compared to the revenue they get from selling the sheep. And what we're finding is that actually the revenue is less than the cost of the feed plus the medicine. Right? Then we looked at the calories, and you find that the human edible calories in the sheep feed is only about the human edible calories in the sheep is only about 40% of the human edible calories in the sheep feed. Not that we'd want sheep feed for our Sunday roast, but you know, in terms of nutrition. Similar story for the protein and the iron and the zinc. Just very quickly on fish. In fact, I'm going to skip over it for speed, but there's a bit in the book about this, just to mention that fish is part of the story, and we need to look after our fish supplies a lot better. And you'll have to read the book to find out when the sea bass is not a sea bass. But just food practicalities. So what does it mean for us as individuals? It definitely means eat less red meat. It means eat less of every meat, but the red meat, the beef and lamb especially, because they ruminate, burp up methane. Less dairy. It means eat what you buy, which is self-explanatory, seems too obvious to need mentioning. It means treat fish as a treat, and it means get to know our supply chains really well so that we understand what is going on in them and how did this food come to exist. And in particular, which I haven't mentioned yet, have my fruit or vegetables gone on an aeroplane? Have they come from a long way away, out of season, with thin enough skins that you can't put them on a boat, in which case they've gone on an aeroplane, they're immediately a carbon disaster. But if they're something like an orange and they've gone on a boat, then that's fine. And what needs to happen, so we need that global shift away from meat. If we want to feed everybody, we need to somehow reduce inequalities in a market, because in a market economy, at the moment the supply chains are just not bothering to get the nutrition to make it available to everyone in the world. And so somehow we need to sort that out, or else intervene in the market economy in some other way to make sure the nutrition gets there. Because at the moment we could create as much food as we like and it still wouldn't find its way to the mouths of people who don't have the money to buy it. Keep the biofuels in check. Roll out efficient crop processes. practices. There is scope for that. We need, I just want to, we need more farmers, and I'm just going to say this quickly about the local area. You know, there is scope. I'm confident we need a really intelligent discussion about what best to do with our land here, in order to do the right thing by the land, do the right thing by the biodiversity, do the right thing in terms of carbon, do the right thing in terms of nutrition, do the right thing in terms of the people who live in the area and so on. But if we were to do a really good job of working out what to subsidise and what not to subsidise, it's undoubtedly an economic opportunity for communities here. We just need to have the discussions and the analysis in a really, really intelligent way. And then we need to protect our seas and regulate our fishing. Plastic. Quick statistic: if all the discarded plastic in the world was cling film, you could wrap the world up about 1.5 times. So there we go. I'm just going to brush over this. So, you know, some of the other stuff, but I mentioned that inequality, economics needs a real sort out. And interestingly, I've been talking to asset managers this week, and last week, and they're clear about this as well. We need to ask, growth of what? Not growth of carbon emissions, not growth of our energy supply. Growth of GDP is at best an irrelevance now, but we can still try to grow things like biodiversity and how beautiful the Lake District is and how great it is to live and visit the Lake District. We can still aspire to grow our capacity. We need to grow our capacity to have empathy with people on the other side of the world who are affected by climate change, because like it or not, we're all in the same boat now, and we're not good enough yet at tuning into an emotional reaction to what's happening to people's lives on the other side of the world. So there's all sorts of things that we need to aspire to grow. It's just not the things that we're currently locked into only thinking about. So a total change of metrics, a change to what we think of as a job, when is a job worth having, and I've mentioned inequality and the whole role of businesses. So here in the Anthropocene, it is not okay to have a business that exists primarily to maximize profit. You have to exist primarily to do something constructive for people and planet, and you can earn a living while you're at it. But the world is just too fragile now to get away with just saying, oh yeah, we're trying to maximize money and we'll do no harm while we're at it, because one way or another you will definitely end up doing harm. I've talked about that really. Just on some inequality stats quickly. So there are some countries. This is the average wealth per person, and there's the United States, third highest. And we think of America as a really rich country, and we're just a few behind them on my list of countries there. But now I've put up in yellow the median wealth. That's the wealth of somebody in the country who's got as many people richer than them as poorer than them. How rich are they? And it's a much better measure of what life is like for most people. And suddenly you see the states flying right down to the bottom, because so much of the wealth is in the hands of so few. And it's a massive problem over there, and it's creating all kinds of problems, and we can speculate about how it's led to Trumpism or whatever, and we'll have different views about it. But if you look at the United States, the United Kingdom, you see a similar kind of story, but not quite as extreme. But we need to sort that kind of thing out too. So most people in the United States are poorer than most people in almost all the countries there, apart from China, Russia, and India. And there are the 10 wealthiest people in the United States, and if you just trimmed them down to being billionaires, so they wouldn't be suffering that badly, and shared their wealth out around the poorest half of Africa, you could quadruple the wealth of the poorest half of Africa, just those 10 people. And there's some really good evidence, very strong evidence, that says that there's a total breakdown between wealth and well-being beyond a certain level. And that level is actually not very high. And you can see that it must have broken down completely, because otherwise those 10 people there would just be in this kind of delirium of ecstasy, wouldn't they? And they're not. They're no happier than you or I. But the fact that the wealth is distributed so crazily has real huge impacts on others. This is leading into a bit of a discussion of values quickly, but I had a quick look at the prison statistics. So your chances of being, if you're born male in Louisiana, even without being black, if you're just an average male born in Louisiana, the chance you can expect to spend nearly 2 years of your life in prison. Just as a kind of, the Financial Times told me this was a distraction, but I just put it in there partly just to illustrate our opportunity to live better. This transition to a sustainable world is actually about living better, not worse, and definitely like that in the Lake District. It boils down to can we develop and foster the kinds of values that will allow humans to thrive in the Anthropocene or not? And it turns out that it's possible to deliberately cultivate certain values. So I've just got a very simple set of values which I think are incredibly important, and without them we can't thrive, and with them it'll probably all fall out of the hat. So here we go, values we can't live without. Just from a pragmatic point of view, we can't live without these. Just 3, and the first one is to treat all people with equal value and with equal respect for their inherent value as humans. It sounds maybe it sounds too obvious to say, but if we could just begin living like that, it would have huge implications, not least for questions like immigration. Secondly, is to extend that to all the species in the world and respect those species not just as servants of humanity, but in their own right. And then thirdly, and this is one that we've been going backwards on arguably of late, is to really ratchet up our respect for truth for its own sake and our insistence on it. Because here in the Anthropocene it's complex, and we need to be able to look at what's going on as cleanly as we can if we're going to find our way through it. And this applies not least to discussions about what's going around food and farming, and what do good diets look like, and what should we do with the land in the Lake District in a way that honours all these 3 things. We need to have a really clean look at the facts, and then we need to bring that in with a really respectful discussion about what we could be doing with it. There we go. So we need to, just on the truth and trust thing, we just need to get far sharper at asking really good questions about what is our basis for working out who out of those faces we can trust and who we can't. And if we can't trust some of the faces there, for example, if any of them have got a track record of being careless with the truth or even deliberately lying, what do we do to make sure that we insist that they're not the people who are in big decision makings, in roles like Prime Minister or something like that. So we need to get far more discerning about when we can and can't trust somebody, and a media source as well. And we need to get far better at being able to insist on trustworthy sources and trustworthy decision makers. And there's a whole sort of chunk about that in the book. And then finally, some thinking skills that perhaps we need to get much better at now that we're in this Anthropocene. We need to get better at big picture thinking, because it's a global challenge now. Much better at global empathy, because we're all in the same boat, like it or not. Much better at thinking about the future, although with the climate emergency, actually we don't need to think that far into the future now. Appreciation of small, beautiful local things in the present, in the here and now, like how fantastic it is in the Lake District and just the view out the door. So we don't need to get on a long distance flight just to have a good time. The skills around thinking, critical thinking and self-reflection, so we just get hotter at noticing the difference between fact and fiction. And better at joining it all up, and better at complexity, which we're getting better at anyway, so don't worry about that one. Okay. I'm getting towards the end, but when it's also, here's the really valid question. When it's all so big and global, what can any of us do? Because each one of us is just 7.7 billionth of the whole thing. And I've said it's all global and systemic. And I've talked about rebound effects and how you squeeze one part of the balloon and the rest boils up. And actually, what we need to do is we need to all be asking the question, how can I help to create the conditions under which the big system change that we need becomes possible? And it turns out there's plenty that we can do. And in this local area, if we get together in this local area and make something happen, that can be really influential. So we need to get better at imagining how the sustainable world is actually better than the non-sustainable world. It's not a hair shirt. There are one or two things we're going to need to be a bit disciplined about, like a bit more disciplined with our flying, a lot more disciplined with our flying. But overall, there is a chance to improve the quality of life if we just imagine it better and do it in a clever way. So, we could all imagine it in different ways, but maybe it looks something a bit like that. And I have even put a little aeroplane in the corner because we can have some of them. But it's a world to look forward to, not a world to dread at all. We need to role model it as best we can, and we've got a brilliant opportunity to role model it here in the Lake District, which doesn't mean we need to be perfect, any of us as individuals or collectively, because we're all conflicted. We live in such an unsustainable world, but it is about trying to move forwards, not letting ourselves off the hook as we go, and just trying to find ways in which we can show that the low carbon and more sustainable world can be better, not worse, and not least around our dietary change, which is, there's been such a lot of change recently on that, and momentum is really starting to gather. So develop those skills and values I talked about. We need to look at all the ways in which we can influence. All the many ways. So how do we influence our politicians? And people are doing that in, as we've seen, last week. And those kinds of ways that people are insisting on it are really bearing fruit now. But, I've also talked to people who run hotels in the Lake District who say, yeah, we have people come up here and they turn up in their huge, big, thundering, gas-guzzling cars, and they don't think about anything to do with sustainability. But you know what? They stay in our hotel, and we have an opportunity to sow the seeds of some thoughts that might really have that life could be different, and it might be better being different, and that might be able to go back home to normal life. And we have an opportunity here, and the whole world keeps its eye on the Lake District one way or another. So if we can make it work, then that's really inspirational for a lot of people. So there's all sorts of influence here. And if you're running a business and you find a clever way of doing sustainable food that actually works for you as a business and makes the whole thing work better, and I think we might hear about some of that in a little while, then that's something that everybody wants to follow. And we've got evidence of that, that there are examples of that here in the Lake District that really are making people want to follow it. And insist, because we've had decades now of clever scientists asking nicely for some action on climate change, and we are now right at the cusp of an absolute crisis, and we need to get the change, big change, right now. And I don't say this lightly, but that protesting that's been going on, the climate strike and the kids and Extinction Rebellion and so on, you could be, I know you could criticize Extinction Rebellion if you wanted to, but overall I've been incredibly impressed with them. And talking to Chris Stark, the head of the Climate Change Committee that gave that advice to government, about ratcheting up their targets, he said, without the kids going on strike and Extinction Rebellion, they would have never have had the political space to get the government to sign up to zero by 2050, which is a good step in the right direction, not far enough, but it's a good step in the right direction. So there's no doubt about it, actually insisting and actually protesting does make a difference. And I was incredibly impressed with Extinction Rebellion in April, just by the way that, the three values I put up about respect. I mean, they were so insistent on respecting absolutely everybody, even the CEOs of fossil fuel companies. I think that's how they managed to get, that's one of the reasons they got the traction they did. But that protesting needs to be cleverly and carefully done, but powerfully done. Okay, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for listening.